Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I open this panel titled Southern Agency Unpacked, Exploring the Mechanisms and Effects of Policy Diffusions in the Security Domain. This panel was co-organized by Professor Monica Hess, who is here with us, and Danilo Marcondes, who unfortunately could not be with us due to the pandemic, and myself, Manuela Trindade Viana. So we are honored with Monica being here to discuss the papers presented for this panel. And the lineup for this discussion starts with myself with a paper called Militarization, Citizen Security, Counterinsurgent Order, Police Cooperation, and the Expansion of Public Security Agenda in Latin America. My presentation will be followed by Thales Leonardo de Carvalho from UFMG. The title of his paper is Assessing Defense Cooperation in South America. How did the South American Defense Council act? In the sequence, we will have João Fernando Finazzi from Programa Santiago Dantas. The title of his presentation is Overlapping Agency in the Security Sector Reform of Haiti, an Analysis of Key Actors and Processes. Last but not least, we will have the paper elaborated by André Melo de Souza and Rodrigo de Moraes, both from IPEA. The title of their presentation is Norm Diffusion and Policies Against Human Trafficking, the Case of Brazil. So without further ado, we start with my presentation as we have agreed. So I'll try to be short so that we have some time for discussion and also for Monica's comments. So it is an immense pleasure to be here and to discuss with you which are preliminary results of this research I've been undertaking about the police community of the Americas, Ameripol. So before I jump to some of the characteristics of this police cooperation mechanism, I would like to start with a short contextualization of how I got there. So in my PhD research, I explored the conditions under which Colombia came to be seen as a reference for police and military operations, contrasting to the stigma of a problematic case this country carried for so many years. So more specifically in the PhD research, what I did was to analyze how the professionalization programs aiming at producing the military professional in Colombia were rearticulated as the discourse of post-conflict gained traction in this country. In analyzing how the regime of expertise of the military was historically transformed across times of armed conflict and post-conflict, I argued that it is impossible for us to grasp the making of these professionals without inscribing it in a broader dynamic of circulation of military savoirs, saberes militares. When mapping the circuit of military savoirs, I often bumped into police professionals being trained by military instructors in Latin America, and increasingly so. In other words, we can say that the military savoirs being diffused through schools and training centers in the region were also understood as useful for social control purposes. This is how I got to Ameripol, this hemispheric circuit of police savoirs in Latin America. Ameripol was created in 2007, this as a police cooperation mechanism, now gathering 33 police forces of all the 20 countries in the region. Although Ameripol is not widely known in the academic literature, it has been operating as an intense hub for technocratic discussions about solutions against transnational organized crime in the region. Indeed, in my fieldwork in Colombia, Ameripol was repeatedly mentioned as a privileged site for the diffusion of Colombian expertise accumulated throughout decades of armed conflict. As I was expecting, Colombia circulates as a police force of excellence in this cooperation mechanism, mobilizing mainly its counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism expertise in its portfolio of courses taught and technical assistance given. However, if the position Colombia came to enjoy in this regional technocratic community is anchored in the performance of the Colombian public force against narco-terrorism, the circulation of this expertise within Ameripol is framed as citizen security. Mobilized since the first Álvaro Uribe Vélez administration from 2002 to 2006, This paradigm portrays the intense combat against criminal organization as the condition for the protection of the democratic society. Far from displacing the policing doctrine, which for decades has been constituting the cement of the war on drugs, the repertoire of police operations ventilated by the Colombian National Police to other AmeriPol members was mostly based on military doctrine, focused on intelligence, infiltration, and tactical efficiency. In this sense, the citizen security paradigm vests the same repertoire of police operations with a discursive asepsis and displaces the radical otherness characterizing the vocabulary of the public enemy, which was so pervasive in Latin America since the late 1980s. One of the effects of this discursive rearticulation is precisely the accommodation of critics regarding the militarization of public security, since the visible face of that institutional fabric now emphasizes what policing operations aim at building and not what they repress. In exploring this AmeriPol terrain, a not expected at all finding of my research is precisely the emergence of Brazil as a successful case. Indeed, it is at least intriguing that we find the coexistence of that privileged position of Brazil in AmeriPol on the one hand, with the dismantling of the pacifying police units in Rio de Janeiro and the establishment of the federal intervention in Rio de Janeiro, as well as the sharp increase in the homicide rates both in Rio de Janeiro and most of the capitals in the northeast region of the country. Despite this puzzling picture, since early 2018, Brazil has been playing a protagonist role in AmeriPol, not only with the head of the federal police as the executive secretary of the organization with a mandate until this year, 2021, but also as the main vocalizer of the so-called South American Initiative of Security. With this proposal, Brazil seeks to deepen the institutionalization of AmeriPol through a bottom-up dynamic according to which similar sub-regional units would be established in North America and Central America. Such institutional consolidation of the sub-regional level towards the hemispheric sphere is marked by two fundamental processes. Firstly, it came to require the verticalization, top-bottom, of police forces in the countries that did not present a federal-based centralization of police forces. Such a process is inseparable from the profusion, multiplication of ministries of public security created in Latin America in the recent period. In Argentina, for instance, the Ministry of Justice and Human Rights was transformed into the Ministry of Security in 2010. In that same year, the Ministry of Public Security was established in Panama. In the case of Brazil, as we know, the Ministry of Public Security, currently called the Ministry of Justice and Public Security, was created in 2018 in the context of the implementation of the federal intervention in Rio de Janeiro. Secondly, the establishment of sub-regional police units is immersed in a temporal line, according to which Europol is framed as the future AmeriPol ambitions for itself. And this is very interesting. Since 2011, the destination of funds, human resources for training, capacity building, and professional exchange made Europol the major provider of external support to AmeriPol so far. Among their cooperation fronts, perhaps the major one is the assistance program against transnational organized crime, Pacto, operating since 2017 with an annual budget of 19 million euros. Pacto is a technical assistance program aimed at professionals for the whole penal spectrum, police, justice, penitentiary system, and the resources are concentrated only in a few members of AmeriPol: Colombia, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, and Panama. These 6 countries have been consolidating a system of intelligence cooperation within Pacto, the AmeriPol System of Police Information, SIPA in Spanish. Sorry about the letter soups here of acronyms. SIPA, which is based in Bogota. In October 2020, the project had its scope expanded so as to encompass the judicial, police, fiscal, and penitentiary domains in the exchange of intelligence information. Similarly to the Colombian case, the persistence of many of the main problems of violence in Brazil has been translated into the push of a transnational project aimed at fighting organized crime. Well, as I told you, and this is my final part, this is an ongoing project. So after raising these elements of the research I have done so far, I would like to finish with three very short preliminary remarks about what these cases can bring to us in terms of analytical purposes. The first one is that the circulation of the Colombian National Police as a source of expertise on citizen security is only possible through an analysis of all the military doctrine anchoring that very expertise on counter-narcotic operations. In this sense, military savoirs are not only silently taken as useful for police operations, but also compatible to the making of the so-called citizen security. The second preliminary remark that I want to highlight is this strange case of Brazil's protagonism in Ameripol. For me, it shows that this public security community being built in Latin America, one, congregates technocrats around the semantic field of management, two, pushes towards the expansion of the public security agenda so as to also encompass judicial and penitentiary institutions, and three, is concerned with how to centralize intelligence as a key condition for an improved coordination. My final remark is that the connection between these two examples resides, in my view, in the expansion of a public security agenda in Latin America. So my tentative point, and open for debate, is that Ameripol is one of the best sites for us to explore how counterinsurgent ordering practices are gaining traction through an expanded community of public security experts in Latin America. So your comments are more than welcome. Thank you. So following the presentation, now we have Thales. Sorry about the changes of hats. Very uncomfortable. So Thales, please, you have the floor.
So thank you very much, Professor Manuela. Good morning, everyone. I thank you, Professor Manuela Trindade, and also Professor Monica Hess and Professor Danilo Marcondes for the opportunity of being here today. It's really a pleasure for me to be here today. So, my name is Thales Carvalho. I'm a PhD candidate at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And today I will present this work, this article that actually became a book chapter, in which I try to answer how did the South American Defense Council act towards engaging in policy diffusion processes. So this is not an article about how the Council diffused policies. This is an article in which I try to uncover the mechanisms, the instruments deployed by the Council to engage on these processes, whether being successful or not. So before starting, I had to drop several parts of the article from the presentation because of time constraints, and I will attend to the most important features of the article. So it's important to consider that the South American Defense Council is an international institution. It was created by all the South American countries having a mandate to act towards increasing dialogue and cooperation regarding defense and security issues. So it had some kind of authority to act towards these issues. And having this kind of authority, the literature on international institutions, international organizations, and policy diffusion points to 6 mechanisms through which international organizations can act on policy diffusion processes. I will focus here on only 3 of them because of the analytical purposes of this article. First, we have standard setting that take place when actors in international organizations define some ideas, some objectives, some policies that might be pursued by all of its members in order to produce some kind of collective good. So it became a standard to be followed by all the members of an institution, and that's how an international institution can deploy this instrument. Having some kind of standard to be followed, international organizations can also deploy its coordinative functions. That is, their capacity to monitor, to evaluate if members are complying with the established standards. So it can publish reports, for example, can name those who are not complying with this with some kind of standards and the like. And finally, we'll have open spaces for dialogues. That means international organizations can promote meetings, conferences, workshops, in which policymakers from different countries can meet themselves and exchange information about policy. So this is a situation in which for example, a policymaker from state A can become interested on a policy from state B after having contact with this policy. And there's evidence on the literature that this mechanism can give place to policy diffusion processes. A fully developed discussion of this argument is presented on an article of mine with Jéssica Fernandes and Carlos Aurélio Pimenta de Faria to be released on Participatory Internacional, and a brief discussion is available on this article. So, how did I try to identify the presence of these instruments on the Council's actions? So, I analyzed all the documents regarding the South American Defense Council available on the former website of UNASUR. I thank you, Juliet Martinez, a colleague of mine in UFMG, for sending me this data. So it totalized 105 documents, and it included meeting records, action plans, and reports from the Council. So I deployed document analysis to extract data about the initiatives discussed on the meetings of the Council. So I included all this data on a database about these initiatives, in which each initiative became a role. So I included these variables you are seeing on the slide, and also two variables based on quantification. The first is issue. There were the topics approached in each initiative. For example, cyber defense, Antarctica, gender issues, environmental issues, and also the proposed outcome of each initiative. That is the immediate objective of each initiative, be it to organize a seminar, a workshop, a common document, or a policy. And also, while analyzing these documents, I was able to unpack the structure and the procedure and the decision-making procedures within the Council. So it was very, very interesting because it allowed me to perceive first, there were several different moments in which policymakers from the member states could interact among themselves. So it's very interesting because the Council opened spaces for policymakers from South American countries to interact among themselves. So it provides evidence about our first mechanism, opening space for dialogue. Also, some documents, some policies had to be approved both by the deputy defense ministers and the defense ministers from the member states. So this approval means the establishment of a standard to be followed by all the members of the Council. That is, apparently the Council could act through standard setting. Finally, some policies were implemented and monitored by the Council and its instance, such as the Center for Strategic Defense Studies. So this act of monitoring, of verifying if members were complying with these measures, means that the Council could also act through its coordinative functions. But let's take a look to the initiatives to observe it. The initiatives corroborate this evidence we found on the procedure. So it's interesting first to note that the Council was able to approach several different issues regarding security and defense matters. So it was already on its constitutive treaty, its objective, and it actually took place. And most of these initiatives became implemented. So the Council was actually able to deal with these different issues. And it was able to deal especially through seminars, workshops, courses, and training, as we can see in this plot. So it provides also evidence that the main instrument to which the Council could engage in policy diffusion processes was through open spaces for dialogue. But also, we can see common documents, protocols, and policies developed within the Council. So it provides evidence that the Council was also able to act through standard setting and coordinative functions. And it's also interesting to note that the policies were all concentrated on confidence building measures, such as the standard methodology to report defense expenditure. all the policies were related to confidence building measures. So the Council was able to deploy these more formal mechanisms, such as standard setting and coordinative functions on these issues. But also there were several common documents and protocols, especially on regarding natural disasters. So the Council was able to establish standards, and especially regarding operational issues, that is, the institutionalization of the Council. And finally, the Council was also able to engage on policy diffusion process in other issues through open spaces for dialogue. Most of the issues were discussed through seminars, workshops, and the like. But it's interesting to note that other mechanisms also took place. So let me finish this presentation. The first interesting conclusion of this data is that several different issues were discussed within the Council. The most common mechanism through which it used to act was open spaces for dialogue. And this is not necessarily new, but it was interesting to see it from the data. But finally, the Council was also able to act through standard setting and coordinative functions. And it is really interesting because it shows that it represents a lesson to be learned by other South American countries, because we can develop some kind of mechanism to cooperation and defense that can coordinate to a greater or lesser extent defense and security policies. The Council was able to engage in policy diffusion processes through these mechanisms. So I'll be glad to answer questions if there are questions. So thank you very much. And if you got interested on this data, an interactive visualization for this data is available on my website. So you can choose the variables you want to look and take a look. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Thales. So now João has the floor. João, please.
Thank you. So thank you, Manuela and Professor Manuela and Professor Monica, especially for the time and the opportunity to present this work here. And thank you all other colleagues present here also. I hope that we have a very good discussion. So my work, it's part of my ongoing PhD research. So I'm here to share some of its findings, and it's still an ongoing research that I'm now in the concluding phases. So I start asking in this work if the security sector reform of Haiti is characterized by an overlapping agency. And in doing so, I expect to look at the security sector reform of Haiti through an historical perspective. It's not a perspective which I hope it naturalizes a kind of violence or political violence in Haiti, but it serves the function to put the security sector reform of Haiti in a historical perspective, which shows some structural factors. So at first, I'd like to make some general appointments on the security sector of Haiti. So at least since the United States occupation of 1915 through 1934, the Haitian army, which was constituted by this occupation, it was the sole actor responsible for policy duties. Throughout the history of the 20th century in Haiti, many Haitian governments tried to establish an independent police force separate from the army, which could provide some kind of public security initiatives, which we now consider related to police forces. So it was a historical effort, but only until 1995 that Haiti finally established its police force. Through this period also, during the Duvalier dictatorship from 1957 to 1986, Duvalier, it's François Duvalier or Jean-Claude Duvalier, the two dictators who ruled Haiti through this period, they established the Volontaires de Sécurité Nationale, or the Tonton Makut, which was a militia which functioned as a way to maintain its power vis-a-vis the army. It was an initiative considering also all the role that the Haitian army had in promoting coups and counter-coups in Haitian politics. So it was this kind of context of army officers and also a militia that the intervention from 1994 encountered in Haiti when it started to establish the new police force. So it was in the context of recurring United Nations missions that during the 90s, the Police Nationale d'Haïti was established. It was a context led by the United States, as I expect to show you through this work. And in the period of 2000 to 2004, we have a new violence and security crisis which engaged the international community, again in Haiti, with its main efforts to also retrain and reinforce the Haitian National Police. So if you're considering historical engagements of police reform, we have to consider that is not a new phenomenon in international history, in international relations history. We have imperial efforts and efforts developed by other states to train police forces at least since the 18th to 19th century. But the main difference between security sector reform and other previous historical efforts to train police forces, which is called for its promoters, it's not only the authorization from the United Nations Security Council, but also the fundamental aim to promote democratic governance and the respect for human rights. So we have a kind of effort to transform the security sector, which is multilateral, benchmark-driven, approved by the host country and also the United States, the United Nations Security Council. It is an effort inside, it's a part of the liberal peace framework, and is also characterized by a plurality of actors. So if we see the development of the Haitian army through 1915 until 1934 as a byproduct of United States occupation, now during the 1990s and the 2000s, it's an endeavor which is put in practice by a multilateral consortium of actors. And we see a plurality of actors and a plurality of initiatives to transform the security sector. So this is the main difference which the proponents of security sector reform appoint in considering it with other historical engagements. So if you look to Haitian history, the recent Haitian history, especially considering this moment of transition since 1994, we can locate in it some key historical events and some key actors, which are the main structure or the main framework which builds the Haitian police historically. So in 1995, we have an important event in security sector reform of Haiti, which is when Aristide government consolidated the full official demobilization of 7,000 soldiers of Forces Armées d'Haïti. But it was an engagement in the security sector reform framework, so characterized by a plurality of actors, especially the United States, but mainly of its former soldiers didn't get another kind of insertion in civic life. So we have only 1,500 which went to the new police force, and many others maintained its its mobilization in the form of paramilitary groups with linkage with criminal groups and urban gangs and some private security companies, especially in Port-au-Prince, Haitian capital. So through the 90s, we see this effort to build Haitian police, where Southern actors were relatively absent. We don't see a profound engagement of Southern actors in the security sector reform of Haiti through the 90s. We see what the research is showing is that we see a lot of United States efforts and United States agencies' efforts to rebuild the Haitian police. And it had a focus on institution building, primarily constructing the new police force. If we go on in history and look at the security sector reform efforts during the MINUSTAH context, 2004 to 2017, we see the engagement of Brazil also. It's very relevant, but it's relevant in the engagement of interventions in Haitian slums, or guarantee the law and order, initiatives that were imported back to Brazil also. So this kind of engagement shows a kind of alteration, which is based on this kind of intervention in Haitian slums. But if we look at the participation in the police reform, we can find a continuity of engagement of previous bilateral partners with PNH, especially the United States. So we can consider that there was a converging action in which the Southern troops and police, they helped to constitute a stabilization context, but they didn't have too much participation in Haitian National Police reform or this overall security sector reform if you consider its institutional form. Its engagement were more related to community violence reduction initiatives focused on key populations, key target populations. So if we consider this broad effort, this broad historical context, some actors, some key actors, they are present through these decades, through these historical decades, and through this security sector reform initiatives in Haiti. For state actors, we can consider the main role of the United States, which acts through its United States Agency for International Development, USAID, the Department of State, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Defense, with its initiatives on police building and counter-narcotics efforts. In second, third place, we can put France and Canada as also main state actors for security sector reform of Haiti. And Brazil tried some initiatives. We saw especially initiatives between the Polícia Militar do Rio de Janeiro and the Haitian National Police, but they didn't get so much fruits as the relation with United States agencies. But if you look at the key actors that put in practice security sector reforms in the field, we see a lot of non-state actors which dispute between them resources for this reconstruction, especially resources from the United States. So we can point private corporation securities, NGOs, and also a plurality of subprime contractors related to these efforts, and also the role of United Nations and especially International Organization for Migration. So my concluding remarks, and I hope we can make a good debate here, is that Port-au-Prince, Haitian capital, is a transnational hub for security governance practices. It's a crucible of import, test, and export programs. And it's a node in a cartography of global circuits of security and violence with SSR initiatives transnationally linked. Also, the United States is the main gravitational field of this network, but we can also consider a kind of decentralization in a kind of overlapping agency if we consider the role of non-state actors. In the external security systems in Haiti, it's a forum for international politics in a field of transnational actors. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention, and I conclude my presentation.
Please, you have the floor.
Hello everyone. Can you hear me? Yep, I guess so. So this article is about the internalization of norms, policies, and practice against human trafficking in Brazil. So these are the main questions driving this research. So first, what are the characteristics of anti-trafficking or anti-human trafficking activities in Brazil? So this is important because focus here is on anti-trafficking rather than on the phenomenon of human trafficking. Second, how were norms on human trafficking internalized in Brazil? This is the main question. And third, what were the consequences of the internalization of these norms here? So just starting with a bit of history of this. So the first manifestation in modern times, or what today we call anti-trafficking activities, was in the late 19th and early 20th century in the form of campaigns against something called white slavery. So at that time, focus was on stories, and most of them were not true or very exaggerated, about white women migrating from the countryside to the city or to other countries to work as sex workers. So there were massive and there were large campaigns against these in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in a few countries, especially in Anglophone countries. These campaigns managed to change a few laws and to get international agreements approved, especially the International Agreement for the Suppression of the White Slave Traffic in 1904. These campaigns were conducted by groups such as the Association for Moral and Social Hygiene, that you can see on your right, and the National Vigilance Association in this case, in the case of these two organizations, both were in the UK. So these campaigns had a strong anti-prostitution bias, of course, and more than that, right, there were concerns about the notion of a loss of innocence of pure women. And these campaigns were accompanied by campaigns against pornography, which at the time was something like this. As you can see, these were postcards circulating at the time, campaigns against this type of publication. This is sort of magazine with erotic tales. And since then, since that time, this same issue has resurfaced or reincarnated in other forms, and the last and current form emerged in the mid-1990s in the form of human trafficking, though adapted, of course, to contemporary social norms in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, etc. So anti-trafficking campaigns in the 1990s achieved a major victory with the creation of one of the Palermo Protocols in 2000, right? So this is an international agreement dealing specifically with human trafficking. And these campaigns in the 1990s and the protocol triggered the creation of various anti-trafficking laws, bureaucracies, and programs in the whole world, and very important, the allocation of earmarked money by governments and international organizations, all of these devoted to fight against human trafficking. So human trafficking became a major global issue, a global cause in the 1990s, and to a great extent, it remains like this to this day. But what does the literature say about this, right? Well, part of it argues that this is indeed a major problem, and this is reinforced, this perspective is reinforced by reports from international organizations and national governments, like reports from the UNODC, or reports from the International Labour Organization, the International Organization for Migration, the ICMPD, the International Center for Migration Policy Development, among others, and they all say that this is a big problem, right? And countries, people, organizations should be much more concerned about this. Also reinforced, of course, by campaigns that aim triggering an emotional response in a target audience. Campaigns like, for example, the Blue Heart campaign, conducted by the UNODC, activities by a famous anti-trafficking activist called Somali Imam, and many others. Well, the problem is there is a larger literature, right, arguing that this is not so simple. And what this literature stresses is that there is a lack of reliable data on this issue, even after, let's see, 2 decades of research on this topic. Second, the number of convictions, people convicted for this crime, is extremely small, even in the United States, right, where anti-trafficking policies are very important. And third, there are many empirical studies, especially ethnographic ones, that found that sex workers and people doing advocacy for them, and also for migrants, reject the use of this term. And what they argue is that anti-trafficking policies are an instrument, right, to criminalize and marginalize even more both prostitutes and migrants. So things got worse when it was discovered a few years ago that Somali Imam, who was a high-profile anti-trafficking activist, had actually fabricated stories about her and others, right? So this was a big scandal among people working with this issue. Well, what about Brazil, the main focus of this presentation? Well, before the Palermo Protocol in 2000, human trafficking was a sort of non-issue in Brazil. There was no demand in civil society or in the bureaucracy, pressures on the government to adopt anti-trafficking policies. So this was constructed, right, in Brazil because of the Palermo Protocol. So the protocol created an environment, a normative and legal environment, favorable for the adoption of anti-trafficking policies, and also, of course, created some pressure, a few pressures on Brazil, on the Brazilian government to do something about it. So what did the Brazilian government do? Well, we signed the protocol in 2000, we ratified it in 2004, created an anti-trafficking policy in 2006, and anti-trafficking action plans is starting in 2008. But is this a big problem or not in Brazil? What we argue is that we need to pay attention, among other things, to the early stages of the internalization process in Brazil in the early 2000s. So at that time, earmarked money started to be allocated by the Brazilian government, by international organizations, and by foreign governments, especially the US government, for anti-trafficking activities in Brazil, including money for research. research on human trafficking. Funding for research was important. And it was in part based on research that Brazil started being presented as a major source of women forced or deceived to migrate to North America or Europe for prostitution. The problem is there is not much evidence for this. If we look at the first big research project in Brazil on this issue, it was conducted in the early 2000s, and it was called PESTRAF. And the focus of this research was on the sexual exploitation of children, adolescents, and women. Who funded this research? So it was funded to a great extent by the US government, also by the Brazilian government, by the World Childhood Foundation, an NGO created by the Queen of Sweden, Save the Children, a Swedish NGO, among others. And this research since then has been scrutinized, right, by other scholars. And the consensus is that this research lacked a clear method. The definition of human trafficking was not very clear. And also this research was never submitted to peer review. For example, right, so this research gave a number of 240 trafficking routes, right? So the children, women and adolescents will be trafficked, right, through these 240 routes. Right? But all of this was based on newspaper articles, right? So all the information about these routes was extracted, right, from newspaper articles without any type of critical analysis. But the problem is that findings of this research were reproduced in media outlets, and they were reproduced in reports from international organizations, especially from the UNODC and International Labour Organization. And in this way, they became true. They gained legitimacy, right, through the reproduction of numbers in, to a great extent, in international reports. So they took a life of their own. And the consequence of this is that the internalization of human trafficking in Brazil was distorted. So a few people and organizations working with this topic steered the focus of the policy towards sex trafficking, regardless of whether evidence was solid. And so these are a few of the groups, right, that participated in this process. And other related issues, like things like slavery and domestic servitude, which are also cases of human trafficking, were not in practice a priority of anti-trafficking activists and policies, even though they were useful as part of a discourse that gave legitimacy to anti-trafficking activities. And even after 20 years of research on this issue, again, there is not much evidence, right, that human trafficking, especially in the form of sex trafficking, is a major problem in Brazil. Another big research project conducted in the late 2000s called Transatlantic Journeys failed to find a single clear case of a Brazilian woman who had been trafficked and in Portugal and Italy, where the field research was conducted. This on the one hand, but on the other hand, this focus on the way in which norms on human trafficking were internalized in Brazil have been contested. So there is a space of contestation here. And this has been done by a few groups of sex workers, right, or people doing advocacy for them, and also academics doing research on this issue. And a few of these groups are PAGU, which is a group of academics in Campinas, Da Vida, which is a collective of sex workers, Astral, a group of sex workers, which is also a group of sex workers in Goiás, if I'm not wrong, and Sodireitos, which is a group in the Amazon. So there are a few channels of contestation. One of them was the Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry in the early 2010s. Another one, the National Committee on Human Trafficking, that has representatives from civil society groups. They have connections with some influential people, including some in the bureaucracy. And there is also contestation through practice, right, rather than discourse or speech. So there, in a few parts of Brazil, so there are local groups linked to the state governments mainly, and they present what I would call counter-hegemonic perspectives on human trafficking, focused on rights, right, especially the rights of sex workers and migrants. So on the one hand, the internationalization of anti-trafficking policies, norms, and practices in Brazil empowered groups fighting against prostitution and against what they saw as sex trafficking. But on the other hand, it also created a few spaces in which the official discourse could be contested. Just to finish, what all of this indicates is that an international agreement was approved, right? But it was reframed and resignified locally through a combination of domestic political dynamics and at the same time direct influence from international organizations and foreign governments. And to a great extent, this was possible because there was not a previous demand, right, in society or in the bureaucracy for anti-trafficking policies, and this facilitated the work of groups that at the time had resources, legitimacy, and a discourse that made sense, and also appealed to people in both the left and the right. Thank you very much, and I hope you have enjoyed, and I'd love to discuss this in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Monica, without any further ado, I give the word to you. The floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I first want really to thank all these amazing researchers that really, I mean, I don't know how to put this as, as strongly as possible, really, get their hands dirty and, really dig into these different realities that all pertain somehow to security, but in many different ways. So these are all papers and researches that, although they deal with different theoretical frameworks, have a few things in common that I think perhaps we should explore, apart from obviously the debate on the diffusion of norms, which all of them tackle. I think that they are all willing to look at social interaction in specific historical contexts and really get into the everyday experiences of these social actors in order to understand norm diffusion in the security sector. So I really thank you all. I think these are amazing proposals and researches that we really need to be discussing. So there are a few points I would like to raise that I think also pertain to the presentations more generally. In your presentations and the papers that I was able to read, 3 terms appear that I think perhaps we should unpack and discuss more carefully. The 3 terms are expertise, knowledge, and information. So I ask you, what is the difference? And I think the differences are very important. Are we talking about a diffusion of expertise, of knowledge, or information? Or perhaps you disagree with me and these three concepts are all entangled, and it's not helpful to deal with the differences. So I would suggest that it is in all cases, in the four cases. I think that if we focus on knowledge more specifically, we are able to understand how different concepts are transformed in the process of diffusion, and in particularly how the links between concept is built. So though expertise is of course a concept that pertains to knowledge that becomes legitimate in specific social contexts, I think that the discussion of what kind of knowledge is being built in this process perhaps should have a greater prominence. And the discussion about how expertise, knowledge, and information, which is perhaps a more general term, relate to each other would be helpful for us to understand the process that takes place historically. The second point I would like to make that also pertains to all four papers regards the fact that in Rodrigo's perhaps a little bit less, because he uses the term counter-hegemonic, but Rodrigo and Andres, sorry. But still, I think that we need to stop and look at the concept of power and how power relations are enmeshed in the diffusion process. And I think there are several power relations that we could talk about here. But because of how we designed the panel, I think it would be interesting if you could go back to each of your papers and ask how the North-South divide acquires expression in the diffusion process you are analyzing. And perhaps in terms of expertise, knowledge, and information. Not only the North-South divide, because it would be simplistic to only focus on a dichotomy between North and South, but power relations more general. For instance, I see in several of the papers, in Manuela's paper for sure, there is contestation in terms, or let's say not contestation, sorry, let's move a step back. And there is dispute between influence or power relations regarding Europeans and Americans. Perhaps France, Canada, and the US bring different things to the table. Brazil brings different things to the table. So how does this North-South divide, understood perhaps in a more complex manner than only in terms of a dichotomy, acquire expression in each of these research projects? And of course, power relations can be discussed in other manners. And I think in André and Rodrigo's paper, it is discussed in terms of counter-hegemonic contestation of the whole idea of human trafficking as a huge problem that needs to concentrate resources. So that would be my second point that I think we could explore in our discussion. Then there is the issue, which also I think is extremely complex, and I don't think we really have good answers for it. which is the military-police divide, that comes up in Manuela's paper, but it also comes a little bit in Thales' paper, but very much in João's paper. So how do we tackle this? I mean, how do we tackle this also in terms of knowledge? What is the more inclusive, democratic, or stable, whatever, you know, you're looking at, a concept of military-police divide that we should be looking at? Should we look back into the liberal democratic literature and the clear demand for, you know, this external, internal responsibility, different procedures, or have we surpassed this and this is no longer helpful? And we need to look at reality and how the military-police divide, particularly in Latin America, has gone way beyond this. How do we establish a proper interaction between the debate on the military-police divide and democratic principles? And I think this is, of course, it's an issue for Haiti. It's an issue for Brazil. So I think we should return to this issue in terms of the different, certainly the three first researches. Then I think I cannot finish without mentioning something that is dear to my heart, and perhaps I should write a paper on this, which is how these different diffusion processes affect the use of violence. The use of violence that is legitimate, that is not legitimate, the role of different weapons in the use of different weapons by the military, by the police, the norms regarding the use of weapons that are implemented and brought to our vision because of the diffusion process. Should we still, again, maintain that our reference is the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence by the state? Is this a concept that should guide our discussion on the use of violence and how it interacts with these diffusion processes? Or again, have we surpassed this and it's no longer helpful? I, of course, do not think. I think it is still helpful, but still, I think it is a question that we need to be discussing. Specifically regarding João's presentation, which I find extremely interesting, about the security sector reform in Haiti, and of course it has enormous implications for our situation here in Brazil. I would like to go back to the so-called liberal peace framework. And I think this pertains also to the other researches, because we went through for some time, specifically in the late 90s, early 2000s, through significant literature criticizing the liberal peace framework. And this association between the market, democracy, and models of, state-society relations and institutions brought in from liberal democracies in the North. Interventionist policies that were brought in based on this liberal peace framework. But lately, we haven't heard a lot about this. If you look at the literature on the criticism of the liberal peace framework, it's rather, not, I would say, completely mute, but not as present as it was even, 5 or 6 years ago. So I ask you, João, but I ask, all of you, do we, as researchers of policy diffusion processes, have something in addition to say to the debate on the liberal peace framework? What are the associations that are necessarily made or that are necessarily not made that were discussed by the literature critical of the liberal peace framework that we can return to in our analysis of norm diffusion? So I think that is something that is quite important. I think that an additional theme that comes up, but more specifically in André and Rodrigo's paper, is the issue of the role of scholars. Now, so this is also an appeal for self-reflection. How do we as scholars play a role in this debate on norm diffusion? And of course, I think that we should play a role in calling attention to the power relations that come up in these processes, bringing other voices, such as the voices of the prostitutes against which there is so much prejudice, into our debates. How do we bring these voices into our debate on all these subjects? How do you, Manuela, bring the voices of police forces into our debate on norm diffusion in this sphere in Latin America? So, I mean, these are themes and issues that I think all these amazing papers really, I'm really, not saying this because it's polite to say it. I really think that whoever didn't read them should read them. They're well written, well researched, and really shed light on important issues. Thank you very much.
Wow. I am not ready for the responses, but I'll try my best, Monica. I'll follow the order of the presentations, although I would not like to be the first one in this very situation. I took note of very fundamental pertinent points that you raised, so I'll try to pick two of them so that we can try to pass the words to the others, and perhaps we can have a second round of engagement, kind of more chaotically organized. So, well, one of the points that I would like to pick that you raised is how does the North-South divide acquires expression in our papers, right? Well, in my case, this is actually a point that you made since our work together in the PhD research, right? So when we think about the circuit of knowledge or expertise, I'll go to this point in a few minutes. But in Latin America, especially looking at the military professionals, where is power there, right? So how does these asymmetries or tensions deriving from power relations, how do they connect to our main arguments? So here, since I am very tentative on my claims here as regards Ameripol, because of the incipient point of my stage of my research, I would just catch some of some reflections that speak to this point that you raised. The first one is the asymmetries, the asymmetries between Ameripol members. So it's clear in these two cases that I brought in the presentation, Brazil and Colombia, that they do play a fundamental role in, and I would say more than this, a protagonist role in as references in different domains of expertise to other countries, we would say with less privileged position in Latin America, such as Bolivia, such as Paraguay, such as Uruguay. So Colombia and Brazil are really among the main members of, or more active members of Ameripol, with substantial differences that Colombia, perhaps due to the historical links with the US, confines the headquarters of Ameripol, the headquarters of the intelligence cooperation mechanism. So Colombia, I would say, is even more present than Brazil, and a step further in the research would be precisely to unpack a little bit the terms of the credentials that Colombia enjoys in this police cooperation mechanism. But also, as you recognize in your comments, there is a very interesting aspect to look at, which is the tensions between, or eventual tensions between the US and Europe in the institutional development of Ameripol. As I mentioned in my presentation, Ameripol takes Europol as a reference of institutional for its institutional development, and Europol has been the major external provider of aid to Ameripol, right? So I am really intrigued in finding how does the US appear, since I am very suspicious about the fact that the US disappeared from the circuit in Latin America, of its prominence in the Latin American circuit. So this is something that I'm also attentive to, and I'm eager to explore. And just a final point that I would like to address is this differentiation between knowledge and expertise that I think is really important for us to not use these terms interchangeably. So I would say that expertise, I see as based on the empirical material that I have, as pertaining to the vocabulary of policy diffusion more than knowledge. So actually the discursive track, or the discursive appeal of knowledge actually covers it with the vocabulary of expertise, because it evokes this hands-on, or this hybrid, this in-between knowledge built in the cabinet, and knowledge based on actual empirical experience, right? Enduring empirical experience. So I would say that this authority deriving from the mobilization of the expertise vocabulary is closely related to this circulation of best practices, of models to be taken. Nobody says, oh, it's rare that we see best practices in terms of knowledge. We see it in terms of expertise. But I really appreciate your comment in this regard, because I think there is something really powerful analytically for us to explore there. So I'll stop here, but I have many notes if we have more time. Thank you for your comments. So Thales, with you now.
So thank you, Professor Monica Reyes. I'm still thinking about your comments. That were very, very, very interesting comments, both for the article and to think about future pathways for this research agenda. I will try to focus on a few of them, and well, I will just share what I'm thinking now, more than trying to answer your questions, especially because I think answering your questions would demand much more work than simply my reaction here. So, well, first, thinking about what in the article, I was dealing with the diffusion of what? So norms, information, expertise. While reading the article, I whenever thinking about policy diffusion, I also remember of Dolowitz and Marsh's article, and Marsh and Sharman's article, in which they reflect about what can be diffused, what elements of a policy could be transferred, and their answer for that is that any part, any object of a policy could be transferred. So I'm considering, while talking about the whole of the South American Defense Council of Policy Diffusion, I'm considering that several different parts of the policy could be diffused by the council, or even within the council, such as from policies, such as the case of the standard methodology to report defense expenditure, but also parts of policies. For example, during a seminar about, for example, cyber defense, policymakers could exchange experiences and, for example, lessons learned. Lessons from policymaker A could be exchanged and diffused for policymaker B. Several parts of the policies, programs, objectives, guidelines could be transferred. So I was considering this framework to think what could be transferred. Basically everything around the policy. And also, this question about how power relates to policy diffusion processes, that's really interesting. Trying to produce an answer regarding my object of study. Well, the South American Defense Council emerged in a context of post-hegemonic regionalism. I don't like to say that it was necessarily caused by the post-hegemonic regionalism, but of course the post-hegemonic regionalism was a key factor. And it is interesting because it emerged in a kind of counter-hegemonic context, in a context in which South American countries were trying to produce answers to the American influence in the region. And it discussed several different issues, for example, exactly because it wanted to, it was a forum to share experiences, excluding the United States, regarding the most diverse issues regarding defense policies. So power is, of course, on the root of the country, and also Brazil has, if you look for any indicator of national capabilities, Brazil was appalled within the council, and it became clear when we look at the initiatives. For example, most of the initiatives, almost all the initiatives regarding defense industry were occurred under the leadership of Brazil and Argentina. So power has a clear role when we analyze the leaders of each initiative and how the countries engaged in each initiative. So it's for me, it's a good pathway for the research agendas. In this article, I tried to engage in a more descriptive framework because of space constraints, and well, I tried to present what the potentials of the data, but I really think it provided good pathways for future research. I don't know if I was able to react to all the comments. I would like to react more, but I think I spent too much time. So if I have more time, please tell me. And thank you, really thank you for your comments, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Monica, for your great commentaries. I have written here a lot, and I really don't have answers for your questions. So I would like to show more some reactions to your thoughts that may be interesting for us to reflect on. Because when you give us some questions about the North-South divide, or kind of looking for the main core of the power relations in the transnational or in the diffusion of politics or diffusion of policy, we can consider the kind of theoretical framework that we can use. So to illustrate my answer on it, or my reaction to your provocations, I reminded of the 18 of Brumaire of Karl Marx. I don't know, I actually kind of thought of it because he brings us a kind of core dispute center in the Marxist analysis, which is between the factions of the bourgeoisie. So it's the kind of framework that we can use. So if you consider not only the North-South divide in the diffusion of policies, if we look at the Haiti, it depends on the kind of perspective. We can see that the relations between northern actors and southern actors, if you consider the kind of relations between United States and Brazilian military, we can find during the MINUSTAH context moments of tension, of conflicts, and also of alliances between the northern and the southern actors. Especially in Haiti, during the 2005, there was a moment of struggle between the Brazilian efforts, the Brazilian diplomacy and military with the American diplomacy and American military, regardless of some kind of strategy into the intervention in the slums over there. So we can also consider a kind of division in the elite literature. We can consider especially the works of William I. Robinson and Jeb Sprague, which worked especially with Haiti and Latin America in the category of transnational elites. And the roles in the, not only the diffusion of policies, not focus on that, but it provoked me to think on that. And we can also try to bring this, a kind of work now, a kind of road or path to follow might be bringing this other literature which analyzes the main divide of conflicts and also of alliances between elites, in between elites, we can also consider, or also between the North-South and also between a transnational capitalist class or the bourgeoisie. We can also mobilize this kind of concepts in my reaction now, but also thinking about the relation between the generalities and the specificities of the case. Michel Hoff-Trouillot, an Asian academic, he has a really good book on the, it's called State Against Nation. So thinking about the military-police divide that you commented. So in Haitian history, the military, at least during the 20th century, since the American occupation, has been a force of coercion and social control inside Haiti. We don't have historical, we don't have the rule of wars in Haiti during the 20th century. The military forces, they have executed kind of policy initiatives, pretty much similar with other Latin American perspective, Latin American contexts also, but they are really, really, your thoughts are really good provocations. So I'm just reacting to them, and I have noted all. I think we have to make a work to put again the critical liberal peace literature also back on stage. I think it might be, as you said, it's kind of muted right now. So I think it is a really good point in a really good path that you kind of showed in this work. So that's it. It's a lot of provocations. We have a lot of work to do from now on. Thank you again for your commentaries. They are very helpful, and I hope it is also helpful for my other colleagues. And that's it. Thank you.
All right. So thank you, Monica, for the great comments. I think this is a great way of framing the discussion. So first on the North-South divide in power. And this is, of course, a central issue here. And then I'm talking about specifically about my article, our article. Because this topic was constructed, right, in the North. Human trafficking was constructed in the North as an issue, especially in Anglophone countries. And it was diffused, right, through different, let's say, manifestations of power. Material power, in terms of resources, and normative power, right? perceptions about right and wrong. But and then just like to relate this to the role of expertise, knowledge, and information, because this case shows how the lack of expertise, knowledge, and information, right, was not an obstacle for the diffusion of norms, policies, and practice, because they were constructed and diffused, like regardless of whether there was solid evidence for all of these, that a few governments in the global north and a few organizations in the global north were arguing. So I would say normative pressures are far stronger than, let's say, the role of knowledge and expertise. But at the same time, right, data, information, knowledge, expertise were an instrument, were an extremely important instrument for what we called counter-hegemonic perspectives. So besides doing their own normative pressures, especially concerning the rights of sex workers and of migrants, these, let's say, these people, like sex workers and people doing advocacy for them, used technical expertise, used information, used data to contest, like, let's say, the dominant view. And then I think you made a great point on the role of scholars, right? How do we play a role in this debate? And I think in this case of human trafficking, this is absolutely central. So I'm just going to give some empirical evidence for this that happened here in Brazil. Right? So there is a major case here, and this was the relation between a collective of sex workers founded by Gabriela Leite, a collective called Da Vida, the relation between them and a group of academics at Unicamp. So what scholars did in this case, right, were they provided this collective of sex workers, like expertise, like knowledge and information, but also they provided legitimacy, right, to their discourse, and also access to influential people. And I guess these were the main issues, right, Monica? It's about North-South, power, and the role of scholars. Thank you again for the suggestions.
Okay, let me just return to a few points here. First, I would ask, I'm going to press you all on the issue of violence, because you didn't tackle this. And since violence is related to the four themes, since criminalization or the use of the military, or, security sector reform, all these issues, the circulation of knowledge, all these issues have, I believe, a huge impact in terms of the level and the form of violence used in different countries. So I would press you perhaps on this issue. I think it would be interesting if we could return to it. I mean, how does the diffusion of norms impact on the use of violence as a form, of public policy, to tackle all these different issues? I mean, not necessarily because it becomes the use of violence becomes greater or diminished, but perhaps how the use of violence becomes a reality, a practice, or even a norm. The second point I would press you on is what can we say? And I didn't make this point before, but what can we say in terms of each of these cases about how the diffusion of norms becomes legitimate. Is there a process of building legitimacy? This is, of course, related to the North-South divide, you know, the idea of hierarchy between a certain kind of knowledge and another kind of knowledge, you know, because of the source or because of the form. So in what measure can we talk about a legitimate, I'm not talking about the legitimacy of the norms that are diffused or of the practices that become, you know, common knowledge or become a practice because of this process you're analyzing. But the idea of norm diffusion itself, does it become legitimate? And how does it become legitimate? Because I think that in itself is an interesting research question for all of us. I mean, even the description of the more descriptive, very important contribution on the Defense Council raises this issue on the, you know, there was, you know, this huge investment in all these procedures that you so well define. How or what, you know, makes this legitimate? This whole idea of diffusion, be it from the U.S., from Europe, from other countries in Latin America, from the UN itself. And isn't there also a dispute between legitimacies? I wonder also specifically, João, it's Talish. I'm sorry. Talish, do you think that, I mean, because you talk a lot about trust in the paper. And of course, trust building is a huge issue for the council, and it has been very much a part of the liberal order. The idea that you need to build trust, particularly amongst the military. Can trust be diffused? Is there a diffusion of trust that takes place here? Yeah, so these are the additional issues I would like to raise. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for the second round, Monica. Well, thinking live about this theme of norms on violence, which I think is crucial. So it's a very, again, tentative, but I would, the path that I would choose is of precisely based on this, focused on this circulation of expertise that I approached in my presentation, and how does it become legitimate? I mean, I think it's crucial for us to grasp a couple of points regarding Ameripol. First, because the institutionalization of Ameripol takes traction in the same context of in which the critique of militarization in Latin America takes traction. That is, a reading of violence mobilized to confront organized crime, narco-traffic in the region, especially anchored on the mobilization of the military professionals in the public security domain. So what I find it particularly interesting in this regard is that Ameripol is actually providing a response to the critique of on militarization, right? Because it's saying, no, the police professionals have to be the vanguard of, have to take the vanguard of this public security domain. And the discursive asepsis that I tackled in my presentation, I think is fundamental to engage with the point you raised, right? Because if we are talking about this response of the police professionals in contrast or to the military protagonism in the public security domain. And this response comes with a vocabulary of citizen security and not a narco traffic or narco terrorism, right? There is also a response that is allegedly presented as something superior in terms of the use of violence. It is considered to be more humane, right? Because citizen security will focus, for those who don't know, right, in the idea that the citizens have to have their rights guaranteed in a democratic society. So how can we do that? Well, first of all, we have to pacify so that people can have can enjoy their rights. So I guess this discursive asepsis with which Europol provides a response to the militarization critique is very important for us to be attentive on where do we place our critique on the use of violence in the contemporary Latin America. Because if we focus on militarization understood as the presence of the military in public security domains, we are losing sight of this other circuit, or more underneath circuit, of military savoirs, which is the training provided to these police professionals, provided by the military trainers themselves, right? So I would go about, I know that I'm not proposing norms specifically to you now, but I think this is a very relevant topic that you are addressing, and a path for us to think about norms that could tame the use of violence by the state in current Latin America would be in those terms. That's my tentative answer. So. I guess the next is Thales, right?
Okay, Professor, amazing questions, amazing insights. So thank you. I'll try to react here. Well, the impact of the South American Defense Council and its action towards policy diffusion, I think it's not cannot be seen at the domestic level. The Council actually refused to deal with transnational crime issues, for example. So we are talking here about interstate dynamics. And well, I think, I believe the Council could have an impact on the level of violence by building confidence. You mentioned that I mentioned trust in several parts of the article. And well, I think that the main mechanism through which the Council was able to have some kind of influence on the level of violence in the region was through building confidence and consequently reducing interstate conflicts. It was one of the main objectives of the Council. And here I will also try to answer your last question for me. Can trust be diffused? Well, the most direct answer, I think, trust cannot be diffused. What can be diffused are policies that can help build trust. Trust itself cannot be diffused, in my view. So what the Council tried to do was to increase dialogue between the South American Council, the South American Defense Council, of several different issues. So through these dialogues, policymakers from different South American countries could have access to the thinking, to some strategies, to some philosophies of its neighbors, and thus build some kind of confidence among themselves. So if what the Council diffused were policies, norms, and objects of a policy. So these were mechanisms, and trust was the intended outcome, in my view. I don't know if I could tackle it correctly. And so the main impact of the Council on the level of violence could be to reduce interstate conflicts. We need to remember, as Professor David Maris says, Latin America is not as peaceful as we think. There are several militarized interstate militarized interstate disputes in the region. and the Council was a good attempt to reduce these disputes, because militarizing disputes is relatively frequent in the region. I would also like to tackle two other issues you mentioned. First, about democracy. I really think the democratization, the fact of having democratic governments made easier for the Council to exist. I don't think the Council could exist under the authoritarian rule in most countries of the region. And I'm trying to answer this question more properly on my PhD thesis, in which an article of yours with Arlen Tickner has been a really insightful source for me, and I'm trying to tackle it. But I really think that democracy, the political regime of any country, indeed has an effect on its policies towards international security, and as a consequence, it may influence the action of the Council, because the Council is itself a result of the international security policies of the South American countries. And finally, about how the diffusion of norms became legitimate. Well, in the case of the Council, first, as we could see on the figure in which I unpacked the decision-making procedure, there were several different instances, and before being approved, policies, when we are talking about policies or common documents, they were debated by ad hoc representatives from states on meeting groups. Then they became debated within the executive instance composed by the deputy defense ministers, and it had to be approved by consensus by all these representatives to be approved then for all the defense ministers of all of its members by consensus. So I think the legitimation of these norms were built along a process of great debate and consensus, at least in the case of the South American Council. And it's important to remember the political authority the Council exercised, because it was created by the South American countries to promote cooperation, because they agreed on the necessity of having an organization to promote cooperation and dialogue on these issues. So its legitimacy, the legitimacy of policy and norms diffusion within the Council was built along the time, both whether on the constitution of the institution, on the decision-making process, with the participation of several actors. And here we are talking about defense policies. So we are not talking about the civil society actors, but we are talking about governmental actors. But still, there was a participation of all of the actors that wanted to be there. And when actors didn't want to implement some policy, some measure, they did not implement. As the case, for example, of the development of a non-tripulated airplane within the Council. Brazil, at some time, Brazil did not want to continue the project, so the project did not occur. So I tried to answer these questions in a more immediate reaction here, but I have to say again that this demands more reflection, more work, more research. So I thank you for this precious insight.
Thank you, Professor Monica. It's also, I also think it's some precious insights for us to reflect on it. And I'd like to reflect on it with another question also. Because if we think about the diffusion of norms and how this diffusion of norms impacts the level, the kinds, and the forms of violence, does the knowledge or the expertise or information, do they all circulate transnationally like a merchandise, like a pencil? If you consider, I'm not making the case for neoliberal economics, but if you consider the famous history of a pencil by Milton Friedman, or all these liberal considerations about the circulation of merchandise and products, can we make a consideration on it if you are treating information or knowledge or expertise? I don't really know the answer, and I think it's really deep questions. But I also reminded of one case in Haiti also, in the context of the beginning of MINUSTAH intervention in 2004, 2005, some of the resistance groups, I'm not making, again, the case to defend it or not, but some of the resistance groups, they called a resistance action named Operation Baghdad. It was 2004, 2005, the context of United States invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. And can we expect that the gangs, the urban gangs in Haiti, had relation or a direct relation with the insurgents in Iraq? It's difficult to make this inference, right? I mean, direct personal contacts. It's really difficult to make this inference. But it's curious that if the norms and the uses of violence, or the norms and the legitimation of some kinds of uses of violence circulate transnationally in the level of state and government, the resistance or other kinds of violence also circulate in the level of the opposing groups, so to say. So it's a very curious fact that might help us to think a little on this great commentaries. And I also remembered of two academics that might also help us. One is the Inderjit Parmar, professor of the City University of London, which has been developing work on the think tanks, the role of think tanks and foundations in foreign policy and the diffusion of norms through a kind of Gramscian, neo-Gramscian analysis. Might help us with that, I think. And I also remember the works of Anna Stavranakis. I don't really know right now where is she working, but she has an analysis about the diffusion of norms around arms control, small arms control. And she had a point over there when she says that during the 90s, there was a sense of urgency to resolve some kinds of conflicts, the so-called new wars and other kinds of conflicts, that made the construction of what she called gray studies in academics and policy-making circles. So she's critical about that, but it reminded me of this kind of reflections on the role of academics, of experts, and also foundations, NGOs, as my colleague here, Rodrigo, brought, the roles of think tanks, especially if we take the works of, if we take the analysis of Inderjit Parmar, the works of foundations and think tanks from the United States. But we can also see that this opens up space for reflections and researches on different kinds of contexts and different kinds of cases. But thank you again, Professor. I think it's been a really good discussion.
Monica, thank you again for the great comments and questions. Well, first in the role of violence, right? And my comments would be specifically about the article, right, and the case of human trafficking. Well, empirically, right, a discourse of violence against especially innocent women, it was constructed and diffused as an instrument, right, for giving legitimacy to anti-trafficking policies and to trigger emotional responses in target audiences. So here there's a mobilization of stories of violence, right? We can think about the stories of Somali Imam, the Cambodian anti-trafficking activist, and these stories were of extreme violence. And this was very helpful in constructing human trafficking as a major cause, as a major issue. This on the one hand. On the other hand, right, in practice, the consequences of this process were policies of greater restriction of sex work, restrictions on the rights of sex workers and migrants, right? And the victimization of people, vulnerable people, who the policy was supposed to protect. So I would say, yeah, on the one hand, but we have the mobilization of stories of violence, not necessarily true. And on the other hand, the consequences of this policy, which was probably more violence against these people who were supposed to be protected. Well, the question, the diffusion of norms, I think this is extremely interesting, right? And a great way of framing this problem. I would say that, and correct me if I'm wrong and if it doesn't make sense, what I'm gonna say, but I would say that policies and norms go through a few filters, right? So, for example, international organizations, like reports from international organizations, the work from NGOs and reports from NGOs, news, right? News in major media outlets. And in this process, a given issue, in this case, human trafficking, gains additional layers of legitimacy. So the very process of diffusion is a process of constructing legitimacy. And this is especially seen in this case, right? Because evidence of this problem was not very much strong, right? So this is probably a nice way of testing whether institutions are legitimate or not, right? Because it's one situation where you have plenty of evidence for something, and a completely different situation where there is a lack of evidence, and even in this case, right, something becomes legitimate, accepted, right? Because these institutions or organizations or people are authoritative, how do you pronounce it? Authoritative sources of information, right? So, for example, faulty data, or even like the lack of data, was reproduced in media outlets, reports, etc. But they became true, right? Regardless of whether there was evidence for this, and this was to a great extent, from my point of view, due to this process, right, of progressively adding layers of legitimacy to an issue.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And with this, on this note, as we have agreed on the chat, we can close these very stimulating panels. I am sure each one of us has a lot of work to do and a lot of thinking to do with Monica's provocations, and I hope this is a start of a conversation. Thank you very much. See you next time.